The British unfailingly thought that universal franchise is a bad fit for India. It would be impracticable and impossible administratively. And then, at independence, Indian bureaucrats decide to make it possible. India prepared or made universal franchise against impossible odds. The Constituent Assembly of India adopts universal franchise already in April 1947. It was then part of the interim report on fundamental rights that came before the Assembly, and they just adopted it. The Constituent Assembly Secretariat realizes that to actually prepare a roll of all adult Indians for the first elections under universal franchise of enrolling, more than 173 million people, right? The largest list of voters in democratic history at the time, and in fact in India since then, would be a huge work, and they have to start. So this is happening at the midst of the partition of India that was tearing the population and the territory apart. You had about 18 million refugees around the country, the killings and tragedy of partition. And of course, there were yet 552 states that had to be integrated into the Union. There were no precedents for such a staggering bureaucratic endeavor. Election institutions did exist under colonial rule, but this was a completely different ballgame. So under the last constitutional framework for India, the 1935 Government of India Act, franchise was given only to something like a fifth of the adult population. It reached just about 30 million people. The British prepared separate lists, right? There were separate lists for Sikhs, for Muslims, only for women. Under the 1935 Act, only for women, there were 5 distinct lists, right? For women who are married to government pensioner, army officer, etc., right? So the franchise was given in a very narrow way, very divided way, and the notion of imagining all Indians as all adult equal for the purpose of authorizing government was beyond the imagination of colonial bureaucracy. What was also beyond the imagination of the colonial bureaucracy was the whole idea of universal franchise. 85% of the people were illiterate. 85% of the population never voted for a representative in a legislative body before, and 50% of that prospective electorate were women who did not even recognize themselves always as individuals, but as wife of, widow of, daughter of, etc. And indeed, when they begin to do the registration, in some places, for example in UP, some women insist to be enrolled as wife of, daughter of, etc., as was in fact done under colonial elections. But at that time, the government of India and the provincial government say, you can't do that. You're individuals, you have to be registered on the roll under your own name. And what they're trying to do, so for example, in UP, the government of UP releases press communiques where the government says, we're anxious that every man and women will be registered on the roll. And they start propaganda, they recruit women social workers to try and help with the enrollment of women. Ultimately, what is happening though is that in the final list of voters just before the elections, the first elections that actually took place far later between October 1951 and February 1952, 2.8 million women were struck off the roll because they were still registered as wife of, widow of, etc. And the then first Chief Election Commissioner of India, Sukumar Sen, said we cannot let them be on the roll like that, and we'll work this towards the next election. The question of the registration of refugees was the first challenge once the instructions for the preparation of rolls were disseminated across India in March 1948. And the reason is the following. The criteria for inclusion on the electoral roll was very simple and universal. You had to be 21, that was the definition of adult at the time. You had to be a citizen of India, and you had to reside in the place where you're being registered for minimum of 180 days. But of course, refugees didn't meet two of these basic criteria. It wasn't clear who's an Indian, who's a citizen, and that was particularly in relation to refugees. And secondly, most of them did not have the criteria of 180 days of residence because they just came to India, right? So they didn't have that criteria. So it was clear, in fact, that some concession will have to be found for the refugees. Otherwise, a large number of people would be left outside of the role. They immediately say that the concession will be made on the basis of an all India. They'll find some kind of formula. And they sit for about 4 months to find a formula because they weren't just, arrogantly inventing things or suggesting what to do. They were very serious. They looked at, for example, precedents. What happened, for example, when the Ottoman Empire was partitioned? What did they do then? And what they find out is that, they look at all kinds of cases and they say that actually there's no precedent for this minute question of how to register for universal franchise refugees. And then at that point, they come up with their own solution, and their own solution ultimately was the most inclusive one, which was that at the time being to register partition refugees on the mere declaration by them that they have the intention to reside in the place where they're being registered permanently, and that would be finalized at a later stage when the citizenship would be determined. They send letters to all the premiers of the provinces and the princely states at the time and tell them, this is what we're thinking of doing. Can you please tell us, do you have ideas how we should do that? Can you think of problems we might encounter? The letter that arrives from Travancore, that was at the time preparing for its first election on the basis of universal franchise, albeit for an electorate of only 2.9 million people, right? Not 173 million people, that captured the imagination of the Secretariat. And when the constitutional advisor, B.N. Rao, sees that letter, he says, he asked the Undersecretary to please devise a plan on the basis of this Travancore scheme for India as a whole nation. So just as an example of one of the things that were adopted from Travancore was the notion of registering people on a house-to-house basis, really deputing an officer that would come to every house and register people, so taking fully the onus on registering people and making sure that they're inclusive. The preparation of the first roll on the basis of adult franchise played a very significant role in sustaining democracy in India. The institutionalization or bureaucratization of the notion of procedural equality for the purpose of electoral voting, for this narrow purpose, in as deeply hierarchical society as India is, was of course transformative, right? The ability to actually bureaucratize the notion of one woman, one man, one vote is at the basis of an electoral democracy. Now, of course, electoral democracy is not something that secures democracy. It's not the same thing. We should distinguish between the two. But a robust mechanism for electoral democracy, for representation, is a precondition for that. And being able to do it at independence, including everyone, was something that secured the edifice of electoral democracy in India from, institutional perspective. Paradoxically, you can say it was the success of making universal franchise that brought into Indian politics after independence group, community, caste identities, etc. Because now the scheduled castes, the scheduled tribes, everyone were about to become part of the compulsion of electoral politics and understood the power of making group identity claims of the states. So while these things have posed over the years challenges to India's democracy, they're also representation of the deepening of democracy in India, and of people really attaching significance and meaning to the right to vote. And we see it in India with high turnouts in elections consistently among, poor people or people from lower and backward castes. So they are the guardians of democracy in so many ways, and as some scholars also have argued. So the fact that, as I claim in the book, Indians became voters before they were citizens is part of what maintained this edifice.